So, Ordinary People, you've probably heard of it. It is a novel by Judith Guest that was later made into an award-winning film directed by Robert Redford. It tells the story about a family, the Jarretts, who live in suburban Chicago. It begins about a year after the elder teenage son, Buck, had drowned while on a boating trip with his slightly younger brother, Conrad. Severely depressed, Conrad attempts suicide 6 months after Buck's death, and he's committed to a psychiatric hospital. After 4 months of treatment, Conrad is back home and back at school, but he has a lot of unresolved issues with his mother, Beth, who is still grieving Buck's death, and she might even blame Conrad for it. But the thing is, it's important for Beth to maintain control of her emotions by being cold and distant to everybody, by maintaining a meticulous house, and by presenting a perfect family to the outside world. Now, the father, Calvin, is doing his best to cope and is compassionate to Conrad, but Beth is convinced Conrad is only manipulating Calvin. By outward appearances, it is a family that's been through a really tough time but is holding up okay. The truth is, they are broken and they are a mess. It's a rough story, but in the end, it's a family that somehow finds a way through love. Families can be tough to navigate, especially these days. Maybe they always have been, because the dynamic of a family is very powerful and intimate and emotional. You're linked with people who you grew up with, or they grew up with you, or they raised you, or you raised them, siblings, parents, children. Every family has a distinct style, and as long as there's no abuse going on in the family, there's really no family type that you can say is good or bad or better or worse than another type. About the only thing that's reliable is that the way we tend to expect families to be when we're adults looks a whole lot like the kind of family that we grew up in. We might want to perpetuate that family type for ourselves, for our own family. Or we might want to have a family of our own that's the polar opposite of what we knew growing up. That's especially true if bad stuff went down, if you experienced a lot of emotional pain as a child. It's not uncommon that dysfunction gets passed down from generation to generation, as if people are following a Google map that's been programmed to tell you which way to turn at every intersection on your journey. But if you don't want to repeat negative cycles of behavior, it takes a lot of courage and moral imagination to be willing to turn left when your map is telling you to turn right. I'm interested in family systems because it can help explain a lot of things. Many organizations, businesses, clubs, and churches can function much like families. We even sometimes refer to any church and our church as a family. In a big sense, a society can function a lot like a family. Any group that's bound together by a common identity and history and set of beliefs about itself can think of itself as a family. And if we really pull back, if we were, let's say, astronauts on our way back to Earth after a long voyage to the stars and saw our planet finally come into view and grow closer and closer, it's likely our perspective would be of all of humanity and all of its diversity as being one big family. And one of the great challenges about being a family member, whether it's your personal family or you think in terms of, let's say, the American family, is the relationship of the individual to the whole. How you differentiate yourself as a unique individual, but you still have ties and you have obligations to your family. Even with those family members you can't stand, right alongside those you enjoy, how do you stay true to yourself when you're part of something that's bigger than yourself? And how do you feel like you can belong to a family or identify with it anymore when family members seem to be moving in a direction that is really out of sync with who you are? I have heard that question a lot recently. Actually, in the last several years. The 2016 presidential election did that for a lot of folks I know. It's been hard to understand how Americans can be so divided, so harshly divided, with competing visions and understandings of our shared history and who we are and the direction we should go. When white supremacists marched on Charlottesville and a counter-protester was killed, Some saw it as a display of free speech, while others knew it exposed that the ugliest part of our collective story, a legacy of racial hatred, is still very much alive and even gaining new support. When the evidence of climate change tells us that we are running out of time, there are those who believe that and those who refuse to believe it. When COVID changed all of our lives and could have been an opportunity to rally around a common cause, we saw our divisions emerge even more sharply. When George Floyd was killed, instead of coming together in peace and with a resolve to be and do better as a society, we fought over how much we believed that systemic racism was a real thing. When January 6th of last year happened, we stared at the news in shock that any of our fellow citizens would believe in a ridiculous conspiracy and be angry enough and motivated enough to attack democracy. When COVID vaccines were developed, hard lines were drawn again between those who believed that they were the right thing to do and those who were suspicious of them or who believed vaccines were an infringement of their personal liberty. When mass shootings occur, so often with weapons that are designed for combat, we can't come together to enact any meaningful legislation because we cannot agree on where the line stands between individual freedom and communal responsibility. So each side of that debate distrusts and despises the other. When the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade in June, we discovered again how dysfunctional our American family has become. It seems like there's something that comes along practically every week, pointing out how much we cannot agree on important issues, and we don't merely disagree, but we've bought into the belief that the absolute positions held by one side or another on any issue are irreconcilable. For the first time in my lifetime, I hear people wondering aloud if they can even remain in the United States, and they are serious because getting out of this big family system we call a country feels like a better alternative than staying and being in a state of perpetual trauma. And to top it off, the debates and conflicts that fill the daily news cycle also play out in our own individual families. In our own family, we have members who are avidly, passionately anti-vaccine. Text messages and emails among siblings who grew up under the same roof and who experience the same parenting. People who should and do love each other, they argue and cajole and badger and shame, and nothing's gained but greater and greater distance and the pain of separation. So what to do? In the Gospel of Luke, we're told of an episode where Jesus is speaking to his disciples and then to a large crowd that's gathered to hear some words of wisdom. Lately, Jesus had been critical of the scribes and Pharisees, the self-appointed keepers of what was right and proper about religious rules and society. But you know what? Most of us don't know today, what we don't get when we read the Gospels, is that the scribes and Pharisees actually hated each other's guts. They were enemies with competing beliefs and ideas about how things ought to be. In Jesus, though, they found an outlier, someone who represented a way of being and a way of understanding the nature of God that was beyond their ability to grasp and beyond their patience to allow. So both groups came together because they found something to hate about Jesus. Mostly, they disliked the way he flouted religious laws and social customs. The scribes and the Pharisees believed their own particular ways of understanding religion and society were the only possible options. But Jesus presented a third way that went beyond their winner-take-all worldview. Their problem was they could not stop long enough to entertain the possibility that in the big scheme of things, they were ultimately part of the same big family. They couldn't see each other in the way God saw them. And Jesus tells them and his disciples and anyone who would listen through parables that enough was enough and that time and life were far too short and far too valuable to be wasting on anything other than waking up to the reality of God living in them and through them, and transforming the way they saw themselves and that they treated each other. You got to start with yourself, he says, in the present moment, to see God in yourself and God in everyone. No exceptions. Now, Jesus knew that what he was saying was rather out there for most folks, and it would even cause divisions for those who could not accept such a radical idea about the nature of God, because God had been taught from days of old as separate and inaccessible unless you did certain things in a certain way and you said all the right words and you said them in the right order. It was just taken for granted, and even today that's still believed. But back then, as the scribes and Pharisees demonstrated, although they agreed on the need to worship such a God, they could not agree on how that should be done. So Jesus turned that idea upside down. What if, Jesus said, God is not somewhere out there, inaccessible and remote, waiting to be satisfied, but right here, already in your heart and in every heart, waiting to be set free, waiting to fill us and compel us to speak and act in love that knows no limits and no boundaries and that cannot die. For that to happen, let's get back to the notion of family, our one big human family, of seeing each other as members of that, of loving each other's like that. We are all related to each other ultimately. We share a common history, a common destiny, and a common responsibility to do right by each other. We are each wonderfully unique, but we also belong. We also carry with us our brokenness and our pain, but we belong. We each have our own way of understanding our place in the world, but we still belong to each other. And the way to be true to ourselves is to awaken and live into the larger truth that God's love in you knits you to God's love in me and God's love in everyone. That's good news, and it's our family obligation to share it. Right now, our social family may feel like a dysfunctional, broken mess, but through that love, we can still find a way.